it was on the back of the Secret Service been doing as well. Yeah. That's all right, I know it's no, he's my first one. I only recently joined as a member for a while. I actually got but the rest is Prime Minister of my country. I've always done really well. Yeah, over here in the other side here, and he's doing work in the golf course. Good to see him move on to a different betting content. Actually, doing my master's at the moment.
I'm Director of the Foreign Policy Association. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the FAA's annual C3 Star Lecture, U.S.China Relations, which this year is being co-hosted by the Asian Society Policy Institute, whose president is sitting over to my right. I'm especially pleased that Kevin Rudd will be with us to deliver this year's lecture. I'm not going to do a long-form introduction. We all know that Kevin has had a long, distinguished career in public policy and has had the distinction of other things that serving as the Australian Prime Minister not once, but twice. And of course, he's also a scholar and a long-time student of sinology. Now, he is so totally absorbed in the money in the culture. Kevin spent the past year in residence as a senior fellow at Kennedy School, and tonight he will be sharing with us highlights of the study he has authored on the future of U.S.-China relations under Xi Jinping. China's rise, of course, brings with it numerous complexities, challenges, and opportunities for us all. Who better to hear from about these issues than the man Henry Kissinger once described as one of the world's top strategic figures. High praise indeed, given the source. With that, I'm going to invite Kevin over and take the microphone and deliver this year's lecture.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Terence. Can you hear me out there? I'm not sure whether the volume is up or down. Okay, at the back. Members of the Foreign Policy Association, and members of the Asia Society, representatives of the CV Star Foundation, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. This CV Star lecture, I'm proud and pleased to deliver. I'm told the format here is speak for 30 minutes, and then they kill you if you go over that. I intend to adhere to the protocol. I'm at the time to 6:16 p.m. But I then look forward very much to an open question and answer session following. I pride myself in being a friend of America. I pride myself equally in being a friend of China. And thus it has been throughout my entire adult life. And the first time I picked up a calligraphic brush, more than a third of a century ago, to draw with no small sense of wonder and no small sense of trepidation, my first Chinese character. Just as in that same year at the same university, I became intoxicated with the sheer poetry, cadence, and power of Lincoln's address on the field of Gettysburg, reflecting as we do today this sesquicentenary of his untimely death. These two great civilizations, China and America, have achieved much. one over the span of 4,000 years, the other over the span of perhaps 400 years. They have both given much to humanity. They still have much to give humanity. And far better they make this contribution together, rather than two peoples senselessly running asunder. For these reasons, and despite the urgings of some, I find no inherent contradiction between these two propositions, of being a friend of China and of being a friend of America. Complexity, yes, but contradiction, no. In fact, in this turbulent 21st century, it is far better that we have more people who are friends of both rather than less. From the history of international relations, I have rarely encountered two countries and civilizations as utterly fascinated in each other, yet as utterly non-comprehending of one another as China and the United States. As I read the history of C.V. Starr, I see something of a kindred spirit from the century-long past. Yet in Starr's case, he embraced these two countries, China and America, well before it was ever remotely fashionable or even acceptable to do so. Starr's China was the China of nearly a century ago, when the early Chinese Republic had not long replaced a Chinese empire older than that of Rome's. When Starr established AIU, the Asiatic Insurance Underwriters, in 1919, the Paris Peace Conference had just decided to give Germany's former colonies in China not back to the fledgling Chinese Republic, but instead to the Empire of Japan. This was also the year that saw the birth of the May the 4th movement that was to transform classical China into modern China, and a movement which in part, within the next few years, was to give rise to the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party, which continues to govern China to this day. These were extraordinary times. Starr therefore arrived in China to start a business in one of the most significant periods in China's modern history. He also reminds us that despite the long shadows of history and geopolitics, individual people like Cornelius van der Starr can and did make a mark on the life of peoples and nations. He spoke of a Chinese century, well before any of us had ever thought of the term, let alone conceived the possibility, let alone the reality. He hired Chinese managers when this practice was almost unheard of. He treated his Asian and Chinese friends and colleagues with deep respect and even deference at a time when the theory of racial superiority was still the prevailing Western orthodoxy. He was ahead of his times. He moved comfortably across cultures and classes. He saw no nationalities nor races, and the ordinary men and ordinary women. He also spoke truth to power, living through Japan's brutal occupation of China. At a time when most Westerners were silent, Starr opposed the Japanese propaganda through his own Chinese language newspaper. This cost him dearly. His publications office was bombed in 1939, and its editor assassinated in a cafe that same year. C.V. Starr also genuinely cared for people. During the Chinese Civil War, Starr airlifted his staff and their families 1,000 miles to Hong Kong and out of the jaws of death, and all without missing a day of work, with a good captain from American Peace, I'm sure. And now and then, every now and then, there are giants who live among us, and he, I think, is one of them. Individuals confident enough in the practical and ethical imperatives of their mission to paint the future with bold brushstrokes, not minor dabblings around the edges. A capacity for courage, creativity, enterprise, and compassion to build new institutions from nothing but the power of their imagination and the singularity of their purpose. We are in need of such women and men once again today. In an age when the imperative of seeing underlying commonalities rather than focusing exclusively on insuperable polarities is greater than ever before. For the simple reason that if we had the eyes to see and the ears to hear, the truth is the challenges we now confront as a society of nations together are far greater than the challenges our individual nations confront in their dealings with each other. Global violent terrorism is a threat to all nations, including China and America together. Global pandemic diseases are a threat to all nations, including China and America together. Global greenhouse gas emissions capable of producing irreversible climate change are a threat to all nations, including China and America together. That is why we need a chorus of voices that remind us of the age-old truth that the things that divide us are much smaller in the global scheme of things than the things that should now unite us. And nowhere is this truer than the future of US-China relations. This last 12 months, I've been working away at the Delta Center at the Harvard Kennedy School on how we could possibly craft a common future for America and China. And my remarks tonight are drawn in substantial part directly from the summary report of my endeavours, which I'm also releasing this evening during the year. My purpose is whether, despite the formidable differences between the two, can we construct a common strategic narrative for these two great countries, one that does not end once again in the sorry saga of conflict, crisis, and war, as we have so often seen in the past, when rising great powers have encountered established great powers throughout history. But instead a future where there is sufficient commonality of values, interests and purpose to preserve the peace, enhance prosperity, while also protecting the planet. This is not easy. It is hard. But I do not believe that the histories of nations and their dealings with each other are somehow written in the stars. The future of US-China relations is not the subject of some determinist view of history. It has been shaped and will be shaped, for good or for ill, by the policy decisions of its leaders, and the perceptions on which these policy decisions are in turn based. When China's GDP, after decades of rapid economic growth, and despite recent slowing, eventually surpasses that of the United States over the decade ahead, it will be the first time since George III that a non-Western, non-English speaking, non-liberal democratic state will become the world's largest economy. This is no small thing. This will reflect a profound shift in the centre of global geo-economic practice. And with this shift in economic power, there also comes inevitably a shift in political power. Notwithstanding this gradual shift in the global distribution of economic power, over the course of the same decade, the United States will nonetheless remain the dominant regional global military power, and by a massive margin. While China's increasing defence spending will continue to close the gap, there is no serious prospect of it reaching parity with the United States before mid-century, if at all. China, like the rest of the world, will remain justifiably mindful of America's overwhelming military power. This is a core assumption in Chinese strategic thinking. We are therefore seeing the emergence of an asymmetric world in which the fulcrums of economic and military power are no longer co-located, but in fact are beginning to diverge significantly. Political power, through the agency of foreign policy, sits uncomfortably somewhere in between. As a result, in the absence of sophisticated diplomacy, over the coming decade we are likely to see more divergences emerge between Washington and Beijing rather than fewer. The consequences of this emerging strategic and economic asymmetry in the US-China relationship will first manifest itself in the Asia-Pacific region. As Robert Kaplan has recently reminded us, geography does indeed matter. It is in this region that the US and China experience direct contact through their territorial proximity, and of course, the deployment of their various national military, naval and air assets. At the same time, it is a region in which China is now a significantly more trading partner than the United States for every country in Asia, including every single American ally and strategic partner. China is also becoming an increasingly important investment partner. To avoid the long-term bifurcation of the region into different camps, the challenge for Asia is to craft a common institutional future for an increasingly divergent region. A region in which pan-regional institutional structures can present best, which at present can best be described as thin, to in fact be thickened and play a much wider regional role. This shifting balance of economic power is also beginning to be seen globally, with China's economic presence in Africa, Latin America and Europe also challenges the long-standing economic primacy of the United States. China's growing global economic and political role will also begin to reshape international norms, rules and institutions. It will reverberate across geopolitics, global trade, investment, capital flows, reserve currency status, climate change, other environmental challenges, and global people movements. And it will also influence the great questions of war and peace in the decades ahead. The central question for all of us is whether these changes in the regional and global distribution of power can occur peacefully and in a manner which preserves the stability and prosperity of Asia, while preserving the underlying values and institutional framework of the post-war order. In answering these questions, we must ask ourselves the following. Number one, given that economic strength is the foundation of national power, is China's economic rise sustainable over the decade ahead, or is it likely to falter? Two, if it is sustainable, will China deploy its newfound power differently under the leadership of Xi Jinping than under his previous? Three, under Xi Jinping, what are China's underlying strategic perceptions of future US political, economic, and military power, including Beijing's conclusions about Washington's grand strategy towards China? Number four, what is the emerging American perception of Chinese strategy under Xi Jinping, including Washington's responses to Beijing's conclusions about US strategy? Five, what is the level of risk of China, the United States, and or its allies ending up in armed conflict, either by accident or design in the decade ahead? Six, how is China's expanding political, foreign policy, and economic influence likely to shape the future of the regional and global order? And will this be acceptable or inimical to US interests? And finally, is it possible to develop a common strategic narrative for both China and the United States that helps minimize the risk of conflict and maximize the possibility of constructing a common order? And if so, what are the outlines of such an order? These questions are obviously riddled with complexity. The task of those of us sufficiently presumptuous to advise policymakers is to try to reduce the complex to the simple, or at least to render the impossible as at least digestible. Therefore, each of the answers I offer below inevitably involve an on-balance judgment that will be subject to inevitable criticism from either area specialists on the one hand, or analysts who concentrate on individual policy domains on the other. My argument, however, is that policymakers today do not suffer from a deficit of analysis. They suffer rather from a deficit of synthesis when trying to anticipate or respond to the mega changes and challenges of our day. And the rise of China is a classic case in point. On the sustainability of the Chinese economic model and its serving as a continuing basis for Chinese national power. On balance, we should assume, I argue, a Chinese growth rate in the medium to high range, that is in excess of 6%, as probable for the period under review, and that is the decade which lies ahead. This judgment takes into account both official and unofficial statistics on the recent slowing of the rate. It also takes into account lower levels of global demand for Chinese exports, high levels of domestic debt, the beginning of a demographically driven shrinking of the Chinese labour force, continuing high levels of domestic savings, at best modest levels of household consumption, an expanding private sector, but one still constrained by state-owned monoliths, and a growing environmental crisis, to name just a few. But this judgment also seeks to take into account the vast battery of Chinese policy responses to each of these, and does not assume that these policy responses are by definition somehow destined to fail. Furthermore, if China's growth rate begins to falter, China has sufficient fiscal and monetary policy capacity to intervene to ensure the growth rate remains north of 6, which is broadly the number policymakers deem to be necessary to maintain social stability. For these reasons and others concerning the structure of Chinese politics, I explicitly reject the China collapse thesis recently advanced by David Shambar. It would also be imprudent, in my argument, in the extreme, the United States China policy to be based on an implicit and sometimes explicit policy assumption that China will either economically stagnate or politically implode because of underlying contradictions in its overall political economy. This would turn out, in my view, to be a triumph of hope over cold-hard analysis on the part of many. So how different is Xi Jinping? Three concepts define how Xi Jinping's leadership differs from that of his predecessors: his personal authority, his deep sense of national mission, and an even deeper sense of urgency. Xi's audacious leadership style sets him apart from the modern Chinese norm. Both in personality and in politics and in policy, he represents one-part continuity and, in my argument, two parts change. Xi is the most powerful Chinese leader since Deng, and possibly since Mao. Whereas his predecessors believed in and by and large practiced the principle of collective leadership, Xi Jinping is infinitely more primus than he is primus inter pares. With the party blue blood, he also exudes a self-confidence that comes from someone utterly comfortable with the exercise of political power. His core animating vision centers on his concept of the China dream, which in turn has two objectives: to achieve a moderately well-off China by 2021, when the party celebrates its centenary, and a rich and powerful China by 2049 on the centenary of the English Republic. Realizing the China dream, according to Xi, requires a second phase of transformative economic reform. He sees no contradiction in prosecuting deeper market reforms to achieve his national objectives, while implementing new restrictions on individual political freedom. In fact, he sees this as the essence of the China model, in contrast to liberal democratic capitalism of the West, which he describes as totally unsuited to China's circumstances. Xi Jinping's sense of personal and national urgency is animated further by a formidable confusion of work ethic, which he also expects of his party colleagues and policy advisors. Xi Jinping is results-driven. He is frustrated by the interminable processes of the Chinese bureaucracy and its predisposition for formulaic responses to real policy challenges. He is very much a man in a hurry. For these reasons, Xi, unlike his predecessors, has the personal authority and policy flexibility to be a potentially dynamic interlocutor with the United States, albeit always within the framework of his own nationalist vision of China's future, and his definitive conclusions concerning the continuing role of China's one-party state. If China therefore has a formidable new leader, and one which the US considers to be engaged, it's critical to understand the underlying strategic perception that Chinese policy elites have toward the United States. The current relationship between the United States and China has been characterized privately by one Chinese interlocutor as one condemned to a future of mutually assured misperception. There is considerable truth to this, as each side engages in various forms of mirror imaging towards the other. Of course, the United States will offer many examples of Chinese mirror imaging, and so too the reverse as well. Nonetheless, what concerns me is that Chinese leaders have begun to form a worrying consensus on what they believe to be the core elements of US operational strategy towards China, despite Washington's protestations to the contrary. It is reflected in the following 5-point consensus circulated among the Chinese leadership during 2014, summarizing internal conclusions about what they regard as US fundamental strategic intentions. Number 1, to isolate China. Number 2, to contain China. Number 3, to diminish China. Number 4, to internally divide China. And 5, to sabotage China's leadership. While these conclusions sound strange to a Western audience, they nonetheless derive from a Chinese conclusion that the United States has not and never will accept the fundamental political legitimacy of the Chinese administration because it is not a real democracy. These conclusions are also based on a deeply held realist Chinese conclusion that the US will never willingly concede its status as the preeminent regional local power and will do everything within its power to retain that position. In Beijing, this assumption permeates perceptions of nearly all aspects of US policy. So what about American strategic perceptions of China? American strategic perceptions in response to Xi Jinping's China are, I judge, to be in a period of transition, just as China itself is now in a period of transition. During times of transition, there is therefore always a risk of radically underestimating or over-dramatizing the significance of changes underway. Rising China in the United States is no longer seen as business as usual. But neither for the decade ahead, as I underlined before, is this new China becoming a major direct military threat to the US interests. Instead, the US sees China as actively competing for political, diplomatic, and security policy space in Asia at America's expense, to the extent that China is increasingly seen as pursuing a long-term policy aimed at pushing the United States out of Asia altogether, with a view to establishing China's own sphere of strategic influence across the region over time. So given the above, what are the possibilities of armed conflict between the US and China? Xi Jinping is a nationalist. In China, both the US and China's neighbours have concluded it is displaying newfound assertiveness in pursuing its hard security interests in the region. But there is nonetheless a very low risk of any form of direct conflict involving the armed forces of China and the US over the next decade. It is not in the national interests of either country for any such conflict to occur, and it will be disastrous for both, not to mention for the rest of the world. Despite the deep difficulties in the relationship from time to time, no Cold War standoff between them yet exists, only a strategic chill. In fact, there is a high level of economic interdependency in the relationship, which some international relations scholars think puts a fundamental brake on the possibility of any open hostilities. Although it should be noted that the US is no longer as important to the Chinese economy as it once was. However, armed conflict could feasibly arise through one of two scenarios. Either an accidental collision between US and Chinese aircraft or naval vessels, followed by a badly managed crisis, or through a collision, accidental or deliberate, between Chinese military assets and those of a regional US ally, most notably Japan, or possibly the Philippines. Nonetheless, Xi Jinping has no interest in triggering armed conflict in the US, a nightmare scenario for China that would fundamentally undermine China's economic rise. Furthermore, there are few, if any, credible military scenarios in the immediate period ahead in which China could militarily prevail in direct conflict with the United States. This explains Xi's determination to oversee the professionalization and modernization of the People's Liberation Army over time into a credible war-fighting and war-winning machine, but over the long term. Xi Jinping is an intelligent consumer of strategic literature, and he would have concluded that risking any premature military engagement with the United States would be foolish in the extreme. Traditional Chinese strategic thinking is unequivocal in its advice not to engage the enemy unless you're in a position of overwhelming strength. Under Xi, the ultimate purpose of China's military expansion and modernization is not to inflict defeat on the United States, but to deter the US Navy from intervening in China's immediate periphery by creating sufficient doubt in the minds of American strategists as to their ability to prevail. For these reasons, the likelihood of US-China conflict in the medium to long term remains remote. That is why Xi Jinping is more attracted to the idea of expanding China's regional and global footprint by economic and political means. And this is where he will likely direct China's newfound diplomatic activism over the decade ahead. As I've noted before, a core geopolitical fact emerging is that we are now seeing the rise of what Kevin Feigenbaum described as two Asias: an economic Asia that is increasingly dominated by China, and a security Asia that remains dominated by the United States. China is now a bigger trading partner with every country in Asia than the United States. The US is either an ally or strategic partner of the bulk of maritime Asia. By contrast, China's only strategic ally is North Korea, which no one would actually prefer to have more of a liability than an asset. If strategic tensions drove the US and China into adversarial postures, regional states would face increasingly irresistible pressure to make zero-sum game strategic choices between the two. China continues to build on its economic strength in the wider region through its recent institutional relations. While the new BRICS Bank, or the New Development Bank, has a global mandate, the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, has exclusively regional focus. As for the Silk Road Fund, the bulk of its investment will be on Southeast, South and Central Asia. Concurrently, many regional states are, however, strengthening their security ties with the United States, compelled by their long-term strategic anxieties of an increasingly powerful China. Strategic polarization across Asia is therefore likely to intensify in the future. There are different approaches to regional architecture and mechanisms to deal with Asia's security challenges. The US and the West are at best peripherally aware of China's preferred institutional arrangements in the region, as reflected in Xi Jinping's Asian security concept. Delivered in a May 2014 conference on interaction and confidence building measures in Asia, otherwise called SECA, she outlined an integrated concept of common security, comprehensive security, and cooperative security for the entire region. Provocatively, however, she made plain that his Asian security concept did not include the United States. His key quote in explaining this concept was that the security of Asia should be left in the hands of Asians for them to resolve. The time, therefore, I believe is right to consider alternative institutional approaches that integrate both China and the US into common regional arrangements, and with a mandate to tackle both security and economic challenges. If competing structures are established, these will exacerbate regional division. Furthermore, any explicit attempt to exclude the United States from the regional security architecture is more likely to strengthen existing US military alliances rather than weaken them. Rather than playing an institutional tug of war, it would be best, and it would be far more constructive, for the US and China to join hands in building pan-regional institutional arrangements together. This will not solve all regional security challenges, far from it, but it will help to manage and reduce those challenges over time. Confidence-building measures could cascade into a more transparent security culture and, in time, a more secure Asia. But this can only happen if both powers decide to invest common capital into building a common regional institution. Otherwise, we really do find ourselves in the world of the zero-sum game. To conclude, what therefore is a credible strategic narrative for both China and the United States, given all that I've just described in this lecture so far? It's worth reflecting that before détente, during the latter period of the Cold War, a joint narrative did exist between the Soviet Union and the United States, albeit a thin one. And with détente, they became a more sophisticated one. In other words, mechanisms were developed to avoid the catastrophe of nuclear war. Over time, however, we have not seen the emergence of a similar strategic narrative between China and the United States, despite the fact that diplomatic normalization processes began way back in 1972, about the same time as détente emerged, as a common arrangement between the Soviet Union and the United States. And the bottom line is that the relationship between China and the United States, even at its worst, has never ever sunk to the level of the relationship that the United States and the Soviet Union had at their best. It's important to put these things into context. A common strategic framework for US-China relations would offer many advantages. First, in Washington, it would help provide strategic direction to government agencies competing for policy attention in space, as well as those multiple agencies engaging aspects of the China relationship, but not on a daily basis, thereby helping to provide policy coherence in engaging on an interagency basis, as well as with Chinese interlocutors. And secondly, in Beijing, it would go beyond this, because of the more hierarchical nature of the political and bureaucratic decision-making process in China, providing direction to the system at large. And third, for both powers, a coherent strategic framework would also inject additional positive ingredients, a common determination to manage significant differences effectively in order to avoid unnecessary confrontation, as well as a common commitment to collaborate in difficult policy areas with a view to resolving, and a common sense of purpose to build political and strategic trust over time. For these reasons, the ideational content of a common strategic framework relationship should be realist about those areas of the relationship which are not possible to resolve in the foreseeable future, constructive about those areas that could be resolved with high-level political effort in bilateral, regional, and global domains, and thirdly, guided by a common purpose to build strategic trust step by step over time, not based on declarative statements, but instead on common action in resolving common problems. The framework, therefore, I recommend is one of constructive realism for a common purpose. Realist about fundamental differences, constructive about those areas of bilateral, regional, and global engagement where real progress can be made, and then thirdly, by the accumulation of some level of political capital and strategic balance over time, developing the capacity to deal with the relationships long-term challenges, including those of sustaining a viable regional and global order in the future. It's a matter for both administrations the extent to which they would take any such recommendations further. Our business and our responsibility, however, as friends of both countries and the United States, is to recommend a credible vision for the future. I thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. That was quite the presentation. I can't help, despite the sort of mounting list of challenges, I can't help but see the really proud of optimists as we're using the words for coherent, strategic, and conjunction with our current situation really does that.
Well, here's that. I think the first thing to say about it is one of the cheapest things in politics, domestic and international, is to be a professional business. Not cheapest in saying business. Could go wrong, probably go wrong, but and you try that, then you give them what it is. Okay? And it actually produces what I describe as international relations equivalent of learning policies. That is, frankly, we can't do it. I do not accept that as a premise. That's why I describe as amazing analysis. And so the degree of difficulty is as I've described. But frankly, there comes a time in complex relationships where if you are able to embrace a wide common strategic narrative which embraces difficulty, difference, and disagreement, and provides a constructive way forward for the rest of the relationship, you might just be able to preserve peace in a manner which actually helps not just China and the US, but the rest of the world as well. And I'm in the optimistic vein for that reason.
So the floor is open for questions. There's a microphone coming your way.
Good evening, and thank you. My name is Andrew White. I wear two hats. Number one, I'm Assistant Director of Graduate Admission at St. John's University, and the second hat is I have completed my Master's in International Communication as well. First and foremost, thank you very much for that presentation. I understand you speak Mandarin, yes? I clay. 我们可以说什么话？没有，所以我们下次会说。Later we'll speak. Anyway, I was thinking about what you were saying about number one, the zero-sum game, and number two, about being an optimist, because I, for one, am also an optimist, and I don't believe in the idea of the zero-sum game. You talked about the unfixable, the realist side of the challenges, and I'm curious if you feel like censorship is one of them, and in terms of moving forward, if the government of China behaves in a way that is so censored, in terms of developing an American censorship. Well, that's another conversation. But in terms of moving forward, I think that education is one of the biggest things. And if the full picture, or as full picture as possible, isn't available, what do you foresee as the option for change?
The bottom line is, in terms of the list of what I described as realistic differences and disagreements between China and the United States, with the hard security list, which would include arms sales to Taiwan, territorial claims in the East China Sea, territorial claims in the South China Sea, but also such questions as basic divides on human rights, democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of information. These are objective differences and disagreements. Let's not pretend they don't exist. All I'm saying is, acknowledge that those exist, and you prosecute mutual benefit in a bunch of other areas where you can agree. Over time, the question about the availability and freedom of information within China itself will be matter ultimately resolved by the Chinese people themselves. The contrast highlights something here for you. When I first went to live and work in China 30 years ago, I contrast then the amount of publicly available information to good folks in China. Then compared with now, notwithstanding recent additional internet restrictions. So therefore, we need to see these things in a historical perspective. And the driver for that change, has not been a bunch of the rest of us who bang the table on the other side. It's because as you liberalise the economy, what do? You actually make it necessary for free and open information flows to be delivered, which can in fact make businesses function. As a consequence of that, you have wider information flows, and on the basis of that, you have much more global engagement on the part of Chinese economic and political elites. And this is the process which is unfolding. Xi Jinping has brought in recent restrictions which take that back to some degree. But I would recommend to you looking at it through a domestic prism of change. That is, what the Chinese people, what Chinese companies, and what Chinese institutions will increasingly demand themselves.
Thank you very much.
You described the relationship as bilateral and trying to find solutions in that format. Are there any third-party arms brokers in the system? So who are they, and what would you urge on other players in the world to contribute to this?
I'm always wary of people seeking to act as bridges between China and the United States. These are very long, experienced, hardened players in addition to the international relations. And so when anyone dances upon the stage like Bandy did, just watch out, you may not last much longer. However, there is a modest role to play. The modest role to play is to try and describe as accurately as you can what are the baseline strategic views of one side towards the other across the board. What I find perhaps a little frustrating is that when American and Chinese colleagues get together, it's either what I describe as conspiracy between science, we don't get down to tin tax at all, or it becomes pretty robust and perhaps a little too robust. So I think there is some value added to be provided by whomever, people who know both countries and cultures, as we respect them, to simply explain both to the Chinese in Beijing and to Americans in Washington what we conclude to be Chinese or American based. That I think can be useful. But when it comes that the party's legitimacy came from a number of factors. Performance-based legitimacy, that is, that you continue to deliver the economic goods, bring them back. And that they've done for the last 35 years, and hence the re-engineering of the growth model now, see if they can do it for the future. He's also very much aware that the legitimacy of the party is enhanced by China, the Chinese people being proud of China's achievements at home and abroad. That's also a part of the legitimacy. But he also knows that a profound source of illegitimacy is corruption, not just at a retail and wholesale scale, but at an industrial scale across the range of the Chinese Communist Party. If you've seen some of these cases that have come to light, they are of an order of magnitude which would have put Marcos scratching his head in terms of why there's so modest in his aspirations. But obviously, on the way through, a number of those who have been indicted, and some will already be convicted, have not been political camp followers of Xi Jinping's leadership. That is the case. It would be wrong to say that it's not the case. You would go through a list including Bolshevik, go through a list including Zhou Enlai, even possibly the Xi Jinping, the former head of the Deputy Head of the People Liberation Army. These were not number one, number two, number three cheerleaders for Xi Jinping's project. At the same time, these individuals are significantly, have been significantly corrupt. So I think the reality is that these driving aspirations have been at the party, but there's been other actions associated with that, which have assisted in consolidation of these political power.
In principle, the American is to believe in individual liberty and justice. In contrast, in China, we have the government 30% control of the party, and now that party becomes increasingly powerful. That's a view that if the development of China, the people of China will become the leaders, but if that hasn't taken place, what would be the implications on this American elected the Chamber of Commerce?
There's a profound question here in terms of our view that's called political rights and civil liberties, about whether in fact these constitute under American global view the inescapable universal global norm. We Australians take a slightly different view because we live adjacent to complexity. It's called Asia. And as a consequence, I've been dealt with so many of our friends and partners, not just in East Asia, but Southeast Asia and South Asia, over many decades. The political experiences of many of those cultures in this vastly different. I won't even begin to touch on the list. And we'll touch on the various absolute monarchies in the world which have had strong strategic relationships with the United States over China as well. The core question, I believe, concerning the continued expansion of the individual's personal space in China, decisions about where I'm educated, decisions about what job I have, about who I want to marry, about the clothes I wear, and within reason the magazines I want to buy, and where I can say to buy a house, and where I might want to buy a house, and do I need to be employed by the government, or can I go out and start my own business? And if I'm gay, is that okay? The answer to most of those questions in contemporary China, unlike 40 years ago, is yes. That's a significant change. On the no list, of course, there is no evidence of what we describe as the universal franchise, electoral democracy, the type of the United States, and other countries which belong to the collective West, but equally belong to a whole bunch of countries elsewhere beyond the West as well. Indonesian democracy, India, other countries such as Japan, Korea, and Japan. The driver of this ultimately is my judgment, is China speaks for themselves aspire to do. And I keep applying the benchmark of 30 years of history. The space available to Chinese folks in that period of time has been growing and growing and growing and growing. And the open question is how much further they will seek to grow that within the constraints of the political system in which they find themselves. A big driver for what is happening in terms of continued market liberalisation of the economy as soon as you open up more space with private entrepreneurial classes in China, which is happening. Frankly, these folks tend to think fairly independently. Not always, but fairly independently. The increased level of religious freedom in China, and it's not absolute, it's increased compared to the times 30 years ago. And my first diplomatic posting, also has an effect over time. So therefore, I think it's important for us to view this through the prism of history, and then secondly, understand that the drivers have changed at the end of the day with the Chinese people themselves. And I cannot see if people willingly turn back on freedoms that they've already begun to experience.
All the way in the back. Thank you. Thank you, Prime Minister Roger. It's very thoughtful commentary on your part. All those who will be devoted a member of the policy association. I share your optimism, and it would seem to be that when one looks at finding commonality of purpose and coherence with things that are called through your immediate problems, you have a number of them right now, whether it's on the issue of climate change, nuclear proliferation, or the question of fundamentalism. You have a whole host of issues where we share a strategic commonality of purpose in how to manage them. That should provide a fair amount of opportunity as juxtaposed to those core sets of areas which is going to take a long time to work itself out with respect to our business. I'd be interested in your views on the opportunities that lie in front of us to work on those areas.
In the policy report I'm releasing here in New York today, I put forward 21 recommendations for the 21st century. It's my only attempt at copying or numerous. And I break those up into a realist box, a constructive engagement box, which is then bilateral, regional, and global. On the global front, the report concludes with asking this question. It says, when you look at the global environmental challenge and the climate change, when you look at this quite frightening phenomenon of global transmissible diseases, when you look at the new threats to security by global violence jihadism, which ranges anywhere from Xinjiang in northwestern China across to Iran in Nigeria and all points in between. And when you look at the new threats to aggregate security, by what I describe as the new emerging weapon of mass destruction, namely cyber, depending on how it evolves and how it's deployed. But if I can wipe out the power infrastructure of New York in one fell swoop by a simple cyber attack, I would say, and the other information systems, then frankly, this is a very significant systemic threat. And beyond that, again, you look at, depending on what happens with China, the huge challenge we have of providing sufficient water and food security to the peoples of the world who by mid-century might be 7 billion as they are today, 9 billion by then. These are challenges to order itself. And I think we may get to a point where nation states looking at the external challenges to the order become hopefully more focused on that than constantly internally expending their energies on lesser order challenges or the significant challenges that they face in their dealings with one another. And furthermore, I think it takes the place also of this debate, which we, I think, are somewhat luxuriating in at the moment, about this smorgasbord of order options. It can be a Chinese order, it can be an American order, it can be a liberal democratic order, it can be a state capitalist order. This is going to be what's called variable geometry. Bits here and bits there, some in the UN, some not in the UN. Frankly, there's a challenge to order per se. And why do I emphasize this so much in what I've written is because it is an attempt to actually deal with mindsets. Because strategic mindsets are trying to turn silver. Strategic mindsets deeply entrenched in this country, deeply entrenched in China, in fact in most cultures, need to be, I think, freshly challenged with the dimensions of the external challenges to the order. I mean, it's almost like you face a more realistic version of the horrible sci-fi movies we've seen 30 years ago, with the out of control comet zooming towards the planet Earth, and suddenly people are going to get it. Well, I'm very bad at seeing sci-fi. I don't like it. But as a metaphor, external challenges to the order that exists are really profound. And the level of political consciousness in capitalists can help bring about the property that I've spoken about. The realist side of my brain says you do it step by step. You build trust inch by inch on these cooperative endeavors. Deng Xiaoping had this great saying in Chinese. He said in the reform process of the Chinese economy, he said this decades ago, he said, look, it's hard, it's difficult, but we should all, water should walk, cross the river, feeling each stone step by step with your feet. And it's kind of like that in my view, in building strategic trust in ourselves. It's not going to come because we declare this evening here in New York at 7:15 p.m. But at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, someone says we're trusting. Well, people might find. But let me tell you, if you embark upon a strategic narrative which embraces both disagreement and difference and cooperative endeavor at the same time, and then step by step take each of my, by example, 21 recommendations of the 21st century, and take that down the football field and take progress in those areas one by one. Incrementally, you build strategic trust. You can do that as you tackle these big questions. One more.
You advocate a realistic perception of fundamental differences, including the legitimacy of the Chinese political system. When you go into that little difference, a little bit more, and indicate, if you can, what your perception is with respect to the legitimacy of the political system.
My view of the Chinese political system is along the lines. It exists. As does the American one. And so look at political systems across the world, they exist. The secondary question is, if a person in the country doesn't like that political system, are they going to choose to invade that country or to change that political system? Probably not. And therefore, to return fire with equally realist proposition, if that is the answer, then therefore we're accepting a plurality of political systems, whether we personally approve of those systems or not. I argue, and I come from a liberal democratic country, which is proud of its liberal democratic heritage and proud of its liberal democratic future. I also know that if you look at the history of liberal democracies, we go back less than 100 years. Less than 100 years ago, a whole bunch of folks in so-called Western liberal democracies didn't have a vote, including most women. In fact, if you go back to the birth of liberal democracies in the 19th century, the franchise was very limited. Therefore, you need just to have a little bit of modesty about how long it takes to evolve into liberal institutions. My own view is deeply conditioned by my own experience. I also believe the yearning for freedom is an inalienable condition of human life. The challenge for all of us dealing with the legal complexity is how the drivers for that change within countries are able to argue and advance those propositions of that. And so, if I go back 30 years ago in China, and I saw everyone wearing either a green or a blue uniform, the fact that there were defined ages only that you could get married at, that you would be then assigned to whichever party or government work unit that you would be assigned to for life, that you could not travel where you wanted to, you could not leave the country unless you had special permission, and that if you ever went to church, you'd be watched all the time. And I compare it with today. Again, I believe that there is much change which is still to be desired on the part of the Chinese people for their own culture in this domain. I've got to say, if we are going to acknowledge what's occurred over the last 30 years, I think we've been matured. And so that's kind of my proposition. Because, and then there's a utilitarian argument, which is if you mount the bully pulpit of global democratic politics and simply engage in the polemics of Western democracy, and don't ask parallel questions such as, are those folks in China now being fed properly? Are they being properly clothed? Are they being properly housed? And when you've taken 200 to 300 million people out of poverty over the last 35 years, you've probably 3 to 4 million people out of poverty. I think it's worth reflecting on the element of consideration. And far be it from me to ever question whether any problems with the American people. I'm foreign. Comment on the internal affairs of America. Gentlemen out here, and I have pointed this gentleman because he's from, I think, the City Star Foundation, and it's their lecture. It's a really rough question.
Thank you, Mr. Pleasure to have you here. 2 questions. First of all, in terms of power, frequency, and problematic solution of China's treatment. And here,
Although it does not. Come on, here. Save time for
since President Xi coming to power, there has been a huge promotion of this notion of Chinese. But how should we in the West integrate, and how would that evolve as a notion moving forward? My second question is, I heard you actually reading New York, so you must be a very close observer of the U.S. domestic politics and the relationship with China. Obviously, there will be a good level of continuity in terms of leadership for the next 3 years in China, and we're going to the major economic issues. So what's your estimation as far as the prospect of the U.S.-China relationship? Thank you.
Okay, the China Dream. It's interesting the origin of this concept. The Chinese called it monk. And the Chinese political leaders, kind of Xi Jinping, have never spoken in terms of goals. When you have a dream for a monk, it's not literally I do not know the precise reason for the derivation of the term in Xi Jinping's parlance, but I do know he's a keen student of America. He would have heard of something called the American Dream. And so therefore he knows how practically inspiring and ennobling that dream has been in this country over many centuries, an opportunity to pursue your own aspirations. And certainly when you wander around the streets of Beijing and look at the propaganda posters about the China Dream, it has a full warm up China Dream. Next to it, they've got a young girl sitting at her desk, being an assiduous Confucian student, doing up homework, a little thought bubble going toward the month. So this is an attempt, I think, by the Chinese leadership to say it's okay to dream for yourself and to dream for your own personal future, but it's also important to dream for the motherland. That, I think, is something to do with the origins of the concept. Certainly every time I go to China, the whole campaign about China Dream becomes deeper and more profound than it was when it was first announced really within the first week of Xi Jinping taking over the leadership. That's when he also launched the anti-corruption. On US domestic politics, whoa, I'm not going there. Another for you guys. Maybe Republicans and Democrats and non-aligned people in the audience. Good luck.